What I do is I work with these organizations who live in border areas, who are working to go secretly inside their countries and to organize their communities, to mobilize them, to join together to resist the regime that's in place. I've been working for the last about 6 to 8 years with young activists, both those who are exiled or living in the US and then those who live along the Burma borders, who are working in their communities and helping them develop their strategies and programs and joining them in solidarity. I think one that is always powerful for me to see is tactics that involve multiple stakeholders on really, really different levels coming together. So one example that's often used is there was gas pipelines, the Yet 9, the Yetagun pipeline that came into Burma under Total and their partner Chevron, which is a US-based company. And they really destroyed these communities. There was tons of forced labor, forced child labor specifically. The local activists went in and were on the ground and were organizing, were telling people the truth and recording their histories, doing video documentaries, recording the abuses. And then all that information was used to mobilize people together. And then Chevron was taken to court, and it's one of the most successful human rights cases in history where a bunch of indigenous people won their rights and their lands back from one of the biggest companies. And what that's grown to is creating a Transparency Act that was just passed in the US courts by the same organization and group of local activists who have come together to say, you need to show the money that's going to the regime. So now it's creating a whole future framework that there has to be a transparency and accountability. And why is that important? Well, the regime is propped up more than 50% by these oil and gas investments, by these kind of development projects. And they're most often targeting the most vulnerable ethnic communities who could literally be wiped out because of them. There was a film that came out called Burma VJ, and I think that exposed to the world the power of exiled media, well-organized exiled media, and how media that's working in resistance can really, really get the story and voice out. And Burma has one of the strongest movements in terms of exiled media. There's like radio, and they release radios, programs that go inside the country, both very underground and to the local people, and they're able to get broadcasts out about what's happening and speak against the regime constantly. I think that's really, really powerful. And the media has not only done all these things as exiled media, but remained largely objective, which is hard when you've got this regime-based propaganda coming out and you're trying to represent the power to go against all those lies of the regime and represent what's happening on the ground. And I think another great success is the way that the movement has prepared itself to think of not only, because it's had such a long time, to think about not only what's happening now, but the transition process. And I think when we talk about strategic nonviolence, we often talk about the merits of it being based not only in the tactics themselves in the moment, but how those tactics teach a society to create a transition and be more participatory and actually train them to have the kind of democracy or government system they want to have in the future. I would say the greatest thing about strategic nonviolence that I've shared with groups that I've worked with is suddenly you can put together the whole system and the whole framework and analyze the power and analyze who's keeping the power holders in place and understand that people are the ones who affect that. And we always do this joke when I started training. We always, there's Saddam Hussein and there's Dan Shui in a plane together, and they're, flying along, and who has the most power? And there's always this big debate. And they're like, Saddam, Dan Shui. And then I'm like, well, and someone always pipes up the pilot, right? Because the pilot is the one who, through his obedience to that system, is carrying these two dictators across the country when he could jump out the plane and, kill them, right? And so the idea, I think, that's revolutionary is when people who are young activists, they realize they're change makers, but when they realize where power really comes from in this kind of pluralistic framework of power, thinking about pillars of support, when they really realize that people are the power and how that system of obedience and legitimacy to those power sources really, really is what keeps a regime in place, it's really incredible, that moment when that starts to shift, and they start to rethink their strategies, because they think, okay, well, you know, we were working in environmental campaigns, and these mining companies were coming in and destroying all these communities, and they know that it's dangerous for them to interact with these companies because they're very, very closely, you know, related to the regime. But at the same time, they realize that there are ways that these guys were the power holders, and they could start working with these businessmen and mobilizing them, and started rethinking this whole structure of power. And I think that can be really an incredible moment when that whole system kind of becomes clear to people and they really understand that. Once you can break it down into how people work in their own families, in their own settings, and their own experiences, they're able to figure out strategy and which tactics are most effective by applying it more to their own lives. And once you can break down kind of examples and let people think about their own context, their own experience, then they're able to apply that to larger framework. And then what I find is really helpful, and I always try to do, is to get local activists to teach each other what tactics have been effective. So once they get, okay, here's how I strategically approach a situation, here's tactics that are useful against certain power holders, and they think about it in their own context, and they have a strong security analysis with that, and then they hear from other activists what tactics are working and what aren't, and why things are effective and why things aren't. Then they can choose the tactics that A, are most strategic, B, are most secure, and C, are most effective in different environments, and use and constantly adapt to what's happening. What's been really cool in some of the work I've done is being able to combine, because I work with so many different groups, is to get them to bring one group along to a training I do with another group and have them share with each other what worked and what didn't, or to ask permission from a group to take what they've done and share it with another group who's doing a similar project. And when possible, create linkages and coalitions so they learn from each other.